Imagine a world where hospitals are still standing after an earthquake. A world where children can go back to school after a cyclone. A world where electricity stays on during a heatwave. Imagine a world where we think resilience first, so that people can access critical services when they need it most. Cities in the Asia-Pacific region will be home to 3.5 billion people by 2050. Developing robust and resilient infrastructure will be critical to keep up with demographic and economic growth in a changing climate. While emerging economies in the Asia-Pacific are fast increasing investment in new infrastructure, the maintenance and upgrade of ageing infrastructure is often overlooked. Resilient infrastructure is more than the protection of hard infrastructure and is dependent on the systems and people that support it. Robust, resilient infrastructure is a key driver of local and national economic growth. So how can we advance infrastructure resilience in the Asia-Pacific region? Plans should carefully assess how risks cascade across systems. Transport, energy, water, telecommunications. Infrastructure systems are increasingly interdependent. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how impacts on one system can reverberate across all sectors of society. Infrastructure should be accessible and gender responsive. Sustainable and resilient infrastructure provides communities with their first line of defence against shocks. Critical infrastructure must be built to last, so the schools, hospitals, bridges and utility networks we build today are still standing tomorrow.
Good morning and welcome to the second day of the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. For our second plenary session, please welcome our convener, Professor Stan Grant, and the distinguished panel.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin again by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and to remind ourselves that the conversations that we're going to have here today have been had on this land by people who have taken care of this place for tens of thousands of years. What we're talking about today really goes to the heart of so much of what this conference is about, making infrastructure and systems resilient. Some of you who were at the plenary yesterday and involved in other conversations would have heard the priority of making the right decisions, of investing in the right areas, of making decisions that don't exacerbate the problem. One of the great things we've seen at this conference is that we are hearing from the voices of those who are directly affected. What are their needs? What are their challenges? What are their vulnerabilities? Now, emerging economies in the Asia-Pacific region, a rapidly increasing investment in physical infrastructure and their systems. Now, while much of the region's population, particularly the poor, is increasingly urban and prone to natural hazards, other parts face increased exposure to climate change. To this end, we have to address the critical issue of maintaining and upgrading ageing infrastructure. Now, this session is going to consider these challenges and explore solutions as well, with the aim of trying to develop recommendations that lay out the steps necessary to advance infrastructure resilience in the Asia-Pacific. Now, we're going to be hearing from questioners here who are in the room, and we'll be getting responses from our panel. Let me introduce the panel for you. Ms. Mami Mizatori, Special Representative of the Secretary-General for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. Mr. Kamal Kishore, Member Secretary, National Disaster Management Authority, India, and Co-Chair on the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Steering Committee. Ms. Gala Malamana Titi Agnes Tutavana Schwalger, Chief Executive Officer of the Land Transport Authority Samoa, who I had to rescue at the front gate this morning. Almost didn't get in, but thankfully has managed to arrive here. Well, I wouldn't have had a panel without you, so I'm glad you're here. Mr. Brendan Moon, Chief Executive Officer, Queensland Reconstruction Authority. So I'd like to begin right now by turning to our first question, and then we'll put that question to our panel. Questioner number one, if you could please introduce yourself and then your question.
I'm Sandra Wu, Chairperson and the CEO of Kokusai Kogyo, and active member of UNDRR's private sector partnership ARISE and ARISE Japan. My question to the panel is about the balance of private sector investment and the DRR, something we had discussed in the National Resilience Council in Japan. The private sector has been increasingly responsible for new infrastructure development in Japan, as well as management of public infrastructure through privatization. The government has noted that the disaster resilience of privately managed infrastructure is sometimes worse as business invest less in their maintenance than local government. But we do need private sector investment to achieve the goals of the Sendai framework. So what is the panel's opinion on the right balance?
Mami Mizutori, what is that balance? We heard a lot about this yesterday, actually, private sector and public sector and how they can work together. What are some examples from your experience of how that works well?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great question, very important one. So we know that the whole of Sendai framework, it has to be implemented through what we call a whole of society approach. And the stakeholders are also named in the Sendai framework. Private sector is a very important stakeholder, and especially when it comes to this issue that we're talking about, infrastructure. Private sector is at the core of this, because the World Bank several years ago estimated that between now and 2040, I think it was like 80 trillion or more than that dollars will be invested in infrastructure, and 80% of that will be invested by the private sector. So of course the private sector has an enormous role here. Now, the balance, I think, is not about how much the private sector should invest or how much the public sector should invest. I think it's about the partnership. One of the issues around resilient infrastructure is that there are not perhaps enough incentives and at the same time enough regulations around what is resilient infrastructure. So what we are doing right now at UNDRR is to work with different stakeholders, including developers, including regulators, to see if there can be a global standard of regulations around what is resilient infrastructure that can be adopted within the countries. If we don't do that, we won't have resilient infrastructure. At the same time, I think there also needs to be incentives that can be provided by the government. So I know of cities in Japan that, for example, would give financial incentives to private developers if they would build a special storage of water under an apartment complex. And that kind of incentive is about disaster risk reduction, is about preparedness. So a combination of incentives and regulations that will bring about public-private partnership is what I think will bring that balance that Sandra was talking about in order to make the new infrastructure resilient, as well as keeping the maintenance of infrastructure to a certain level.
Mr. Tutavana-Schwalger, do you want to talk about the experience from where you are as well when it comes to infrastructure? And one of the questions went to the idea of ageing infrastructure as well. And what's been your experience in getting that balance right between public and private?
Yeah, thank you, Stan. And before I proceed to answer the question, as is customary in our home country, to acknowledge our ancestors and traditional owners of the land, I must acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are on, here in South Brisbane, past, present, and emerging. Yes, with our work at Land Transport Authority in Samoa, we look after all the roads, bridges, the land transport infrastructure. So the private sector is very crucial in our line of work in terms of climate resilience and sustainability. Now, how we have tried to achieve this balance is through partnership, as Mami had mentioned, is the involvement of our local firms or engineering firms during times of when we design our roads. And then also during the construction is carried out by our local contractors. Now, in order to ensure with our government, we try to promote more involvement by our local contractors, especially with our large donor-funded projects that are mainly funded by our development partners such as World Bank and Asian Development Bank. Now, any government of a Pacific Island country in this room would agree with me that it is a challenge to have our local contractors qualify for these donor-funded works because of the procurement requirements that are set therein. We acknowledge and appreciate why there is a need for those requirements to be put in, but we have been very fortunate to have this conversation between our government as well with our development partners to see how we could reach a compromise to satisfy the donors' requirements, and at the same time, we're promoting the use of our local contractors. Why is this important for Land Transport Authority and our government? It's because it's our local contractors who are going to have to maintain this infrastructure. So there is absolutely, it's not cost-effective, not efficient if we do not have our local contractors partake right from the start.
Is that changing now, or is it not changing fast enough?
It is changing Stan, so that's the good thing. But I think there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. Like I said, our partners such as World Bank and Asian Development Bank have been very good at working with us to try and achieve the goal that works for the government as well as for their requirements.
I'll go to Kamal in just a minute. Just one more question on that. What is required to make that change? Is it for the institutions themselves to change the way that they work? Or is it for Samoa to meet the institution's demands? Or is there somewhere in the middle of that? I'll go to Kamal in a moment, but could you speak to that? Yeah.
Just me?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I think we've got to find a middle ground. Again, the goal of our government is to ensure that we're promoting more involvement of our local people, our local contractors, use of our local materials. Obviously, these have direct impacts into our economy. It'll contribute towards our economic growth, but also at the same time, like I said, we cannot effectively and efficiently maintain this infrastructure if we don't have our locals participate from the start. So it has to be a middle ground. Yeah.
So Stan, this was a great question. And when we talk about public-private partnership in infrastructure, there is the issue of financing, there is the issue of capacity, there is the issue of standards, but there is also functional complementarity, which is that whether a piece of infrastructure or an infrastructure system is funded publicly or privately, it must be informed by common risk assessments. And that is a space where I think governments have to play the leading role in making available risk information, what your infrastructure is going to be exposed to today, tomorrow, 10 years from now. That risk information really needs to become a public good, available easily, so that whether the project is privately funded or publicly funded, it becomes a bankable project because, over the life cycle of the project, it makes economic sense to invest in it. So I think that complementarity is key as well. Governments, public sector bringing in risk knowledge, private sector are the public institutions bringing in the money for it?
Let's go to our second question.
Kia ora koutou katoa. My name's Suzanne Paisley. I work for the National Emergency Management Agency in New Zealand. Here's my question. Maximising or sustaining connectivity and continuity of basic services provided by infrastructure systems must be a top consideration for all infrastructure operators and disaster managers. This is clearly outlined in Target D of the Sendai framework. In your experience, how can we better work together to collect and apply data on infrastructure loss and damage and service disruption to better inform future decision-making? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Brendan?
Thank you. That's a great question. And one of the things that struck me about yesterday's presentation from the Premier were all those powerful images that we saw of before and after shots of disasters. But it was the very, very diverse nature of the communities which all of us here service when we are talking about the maintenance and the resilience of essential infrastructure systems. We are all working with rural, remote, coastal, First Nations, metropolitan communities. And the infrastructure that connects and allows these communities to not only function but flourish, we all recognise they have different degrees of climate resilience. And they mean different things to many of those communities. And understanding the importance of key supply chains, energy and communication networks, their vulnerabilities and the community's priorities in rebuilding them after a disaster is key to understanding that as policy makers and also as recovery and resilience practitioners. We not only need to look at the service they provide, I believe, is that we need to understand the systemic impacts if they don't function. And by way of example, if I can just use Lockhart River, for example, like Indigenous community, 2,500 kilometres north of Brisbane, one road in, and if that road is impacted by a natural disaster, all fuel, all foodstuffs, all services must be barged in. And for an example, we have fuel costs go from $2.90 a litre to almost $4 a litre. Understanding the impacts to the functioning of that community are extremely important when we have these conversations about resilient infrastructure networks. So we need to understand the local context. We need to have all parties, much broader conversation than just disaster managers in this space so that we understand what communities' priorities actually are. The second point I'd like to make in terms of understanding and the importance of data there is the evolution of data technology and the systems that support that and the intelligence we derive from that is changing exponentially. But our real challenge here, and I think for all of us, is actually how do we make this more available to the communities we serve? Yep. And I think what our experience here, 100 events in the last decade, is that we were continually rebuilding and reconstructing in the same place, the same technologies and the same structures. But our communities were saying, you're spending all this money in our community, but how are you making us more safe and stronger for future events? And upon hearing that, it got us thinking about, well, we're doing the same thing in the same place again. How do we change this? And the solution is not technologically challenging. It's captured here on a mobile phone using geotagged photos, an off-the-shelf spatial platform where we now have captured every asset in Queensland and how they have performed after each natural disaster in terms of functionality and the cost to repair it. And we've developed that into a heat map now that's available on a web-based application to all councils, and that informs future investment, but also maintenance programs, which is a key component which we've just identified. Bringing that together, they are the challenges for us into the future, is leveraging the local knowledge, the local solutions, and then also the technology that we are now dealing with.
Mami Mizzatori, you do a lot of travel and you go to a lot of different places, and just listening to Brendan outlining the difficulties in a country like Australia, which is vast and there are different communities and different levels of infrastructure and different needs, and communities are affected in different ways. How do you then apply that internationally when you're dealing with different countries? It can't just be a one-size-fits-all approach, can it? So how do you meet different demands in different places with the consistency that's required in that response as well?
So the global consistency is written in the Sendai framework. What is written in the Sendai framework is what we need to follow in order to make our societies and our infrastructure resilient. And the indicators that were later developed in order to implement the Sendai framework, there are 38 of them, gives us, if you will, the targets that we need to fulfill. But as you say, Stan, every country is different. And for that, every country should have its own national strategy for disaster risk reduction. One of the work we do is to support the countries to have them. And when we support the countries to have their own national strategy for disaster risk reduction, we also encourage them to come up with their own, what we call custom indicators, which is aligned to their own unique situation. And as you mentioned, for example, in a country like Australia, which is a federal state, then you have the national, but then you have the different states. And what I've observing more and more in the federal countries is exactly what is happening now in Australia, that the vertical link between the federal and the state is becoming stronger in order to have a more robust system of risk governance. But if I can just add one point, answering the lady's question about working together, one important thing about loss and damage, currently getting more and more important, is we need to connect better the historical data around loss and damage with the future loss and damage analytics, including climate risk, which is sometimes not there. And the reason why is that many times, even in a small country and more in a bigger country, the disaster risk management agencies and the environment agencies do not talk to each other that much. Therefore, the climate risk future analytics, which need to come into the loss and damage analysis, does not figure in there. So I would say that working together within the same government, asking all the ministries to work together, bringing together all the sectors together is getting increasingly important.
Now, we'll go to our third question, which I'll be asking. We're going to bring in our guest panellist, USAID Administrator Samantha Powell. She's unable to join in the session, but will respond to the question. The question is, what are your top 3 messages to fellow governments and partners about scaling up investment and ongoing management of resilient infrastructure in the region? We'll go to the recorded response from Samantha Powell.
Earlier this month, I traveled to Pakistan, where I witnessed the aftermath of the worst flood in the nation's history, a result of climate change-induced glacial melt and intense monsoon storms. While I was there, I had the chance to fly over the country by helicopter and survey the damage from above. I flew for hours, and although I was hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest ocean, land was barely visible. Everything, homes, places of worship, schools, farmland that has been cultivated for generations, all of it was underwater. In many places, only the tops of very tall trees poke through the surface. Because of these floods, 33 million people across Pakistan, many of whom are among the nation's poorest and have contributed the least to climate change, have been displaced. Nearly 1,500 people have died. Unfortunately, we know that climate-related disasters like these will continue to happen. So as we make the fundamental changes needed to decarbonize our economies, we must also prepare for the disasters to come. This brings me to my first message. Knowledge saves lives. In the Philippines, USAID is providing technical training to support the government's early warning systems, systems that can mean the difference between life and death. In 2013, the Philippines was struck by a super typhoon that claimed nearly 7,000 lives. But when a similar-sized super typhoon, Typhoon Ray, struck the Philippines last year, 400 people were killed. While we hope to get the number of deaths down to 0, early warning systems and improved evacuation plans were crucial to getting people to safety. In addition to the human toll, climate-related disasters are causing billions of dollars worth of damage. Which brings me to my second message. The world needs disaster-resilient infrastructure in every country. In Pakistan, the recent floods destroyed nearly 2 million homes, nearly 6,600 kilometers of roads, and nearly 19,000 schools. But some of the buildings still standing and serving as shelters in some of the worst-hit areas are state-of-the-art disaster-resilient schools that USAID and the Pakistani government built together after the devastating floods that swept through Pakistan back in 2010. President Biden has pledged to work with Congress to invest $3 billion toward climate adaptation by 2024 through his Prepare initiative. This will mean working with governments to create adaptation plans that will help countries build and finance infrastructure that can withstand floods, droughts, and scorching heat waves. But all countries need to embrace the urgency of this work. Which brings me to my third and final message. We must work together to expand our partnerships for resilient infrastructure. I urge countries to join partnerships like the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, a coalition of NGOs, businesses, and countries co-led by our government and that of the government of India, to harness the resources and expertise needed to build resilient infrastructure. I'm proud to say that in just the last few months, we welcomed 4 new countries to CDRI: Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Tajikistan, and Madagascar. But our reach must go further, and our partnerships can grow stronger. We cannot tackle the climate crisis alone, and we cannot adapt to the crisis alone. Instead, we must come together to save lives and better protect communities most at risk. Thank you.
Kamal, I might go to you on that. You heard from Samantha Power there 3 things that she was looking at. What would you add to that or supplement to that?
I think she has covered it all, but I can elaborate it a little bit more. And it's, I think the urgency that she's highlighting about working together on disaster resilient infrastructure cannot be overemphasized. I just want to say that we are at a critical point as humanity. Our infrastructure systems are going to look very different in 20 years from now. If we are going towards solar or wind, these are infrastructure systems on which we don't have a century of experience like we have with traditional energy systems, traditional transport systems. So while we are decarbonizing, it is important that we decarbonize it in a manner that it is resilient to physical, climate, and disaster risk. And we must not forget geophysical risks also. Of course, we have more windy and wet conditions, dry and dusty conditions, but also, earthquakes haven't disappeared. So it is really important that this rapid transition that is happening in our infrastructure systems is matched by enough efforts to make them resilient through making risk knowledge a public good, through coming up with standards. SRSG has been championing that, through making sure that the systems that finance infrastructure, the financing of infrastructure system nudges us towards resilience rather than risk. And finally, just one point that there is a lot of risk already in the global system, and that will manifest itself in terms of losses. We need to have predictable systems to build back better in a resilient fashion. So for that, you have to set up the systems before a disaster occurs, not after. So, the kind of examples that Brandon was giving, that when you lose infrastructure in a disaster, how do you ensure that you rebuild it in a manner that it is more resilient?
And you're talking there, Kamal, too, about an ideal world, and we don't live in an ideal world. Countries, and I've reported from Pakistan, I was there for the 2010 floods, I was there for the earthquake before that. Countries that are devastated by these disasters that don't necessarily have systems that you may take for granted in other countries. So how do we deal with that, knowing that we don't live in an ideal world, and countries come to this differently with their own stresses and tensions, their own political systems, and there is a geopolitical overlay to that as well.
So there are two parts to my answer to that. The first is that there are things where global collaboration can add value. There are countries that may have limited access to risk information, and there are other countries that may have access capacity. So if we have a global cooperation framework, next year it will be India's presidency of G20, and we will promote the notion of a working group on disaster risk reduction, so that G20 works together not just for itself, but for the world. If a national Met agency has great capacity, then why can't it support Met agencies in neighboring countries where there may be less capacity? So I think that's one thing, that globally we have enough capacity to serve the needs of the humanity. How do we set up a system to make that happen? The second point is that there is no substitute to having local capacities, local institutions. So the global cooperation is not a substitute for what needs to happen locally. So we must do both.
Brendan, you're going to be taking on a new role in Australia soon, which will be aiming to achieve just that. Even in a country with robust systems and institutions and checks and balances, we have competing sovereignties, and we know that we've seen in our own response to natural disaster or to COVID, in being able to coordinate that is absolutely critical. So even in a country like Australia, what do you learn from what Samantha Power just outlined and what Kamal added?
We find ourselves right now in almost a period of permanent recovery with many of our nations, many of our communities being continually impacted by these disasters. But you know what? We know what works. And it is about governance. It is about those partnerships that you established prior to events. But that's the real challenge in the current environment, because we are continually rebuilding, reinvesting in building more resilient infrastructure systems, but also rebuilding our communities. So getting those governance arrangements in place now, we have an opportunity, and we need to move quickly as a nation, as a global community. And I think importantly also, we still recognise we get the best outcomes when it is locally led, facilitated and coordinated by then all levels of government. We need to have not only that bottom-up approach in identifying what communities' priorities are, but the top-down approach to actually incentivise and make those arrangements work and support those arrangements before a disaster, during a disaster, during and then following during the recovery phase. The data is in now. We know what we need to do as a global community. So we need to start that process. We need to invest in it now because we have a short window of opportunity.
There is a sense, though, even in Australia, that we're constantly relearning the lessons of the past. We go back to start again. There's another disaster and we go, we must learn how to respond to that better. We've seen throughout the recent floods in Australia where even emergency response times or people standing on tops of roofs unable to get help, or access to internet services, mobile phone coverage where people are stranded. Even a country as wealthy with systems as entrenched and robust as Australia, we always seem to be learning the lesson of the previous disaster over and over again. How do we ensure that we don't do that? That we're actually moving forward and not having to revisit the failings of the past?
And this is the important, I believe, of the Sendai framework. And if we look at the goals of the Sendai framework, they are inherent and they are flexible enough for all of us to grab a lesson from and actually move the preparedness of our communities and our ability to respond, recover after events and take that forward. It is having a better understanding as a community of the risks we face, not only based on the historical impact of events, but also looking into the future and having an idea and an understanding of what climate change means to us. And it's about those governance arrangements then. So how do we have in place the necessary arrangements to deal with a significant event on a national basis, not just at that local level? And we are being continually challenged by the size, scale and intensity of the events that we are now making the arrangements here in Australia, but also in the rest of the globe, to actually deal with those cross-border issues. And that's the investment and the change in thinking about the policy settings and the investment settings that are required, and there's a massive appetite for that right now.
Before I move on to our next question, I might get a response from you just on this, because what Samantha Power was talking about is precisely what you were talking about. It's countries like Samoa who are having to deal with this in real time, in real emergencies, and relying on the sort of systems that she was talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stan, and that is very true in the case for Samoa as well as our Pacific Island countries. Samoa having to face a measles epidemic in 2019, and then followed straight after by a COVID pandemic. And at this point in time, Samoa is preparing for a potential volcanic and earthquake activity from our neighboring islands of American Samoa. So we are one of those countries which were facing different disasters in such a short period of time, but we have limited resources. We do not have the financing to prepare ourselves for, these many disasters in a short period of time. But time and time again, it has proven that it is our people. It is our people who have been resilient and have been able to adapt with any challenge that we have come across. If you have been fortunate to meet our Samoan delegation attending this conference, you will find that all of us, such as myself, we are, supposedly meant to be at the policy level, decision-making level of our country. During disasters, we come right down to the ground, and we are actually doing the response works to our villages. While this can be very challenging and exhausting and a huge sacrifice on us as well as our families whom we have to leave in order to do our work, this has given us a very good insight on what is needed on the ground. So then there's not much disconnect on the policy and the decision level, decision making that we do in government that is relevant and is applicable to actually help out the people that actually need the help, especially during any disaster. So I just would like to throw in that perspective from how we in Samoa having limited resources, but at the same time, it's a blessing in disguise, I guess. It really helps.
More accountable, directly accountable. Exactly. Question number 4.
Thank you. Namaste and good morning, everyone. My name is Dilli Prasad Paudel, and I'm from South Asia Institute of Advanced Studies, located in Kathmandu. And the question is, it is important to have a common understanding about infrastructure resilience, as well as steps and actions needed to achieve it. How can we define and prioritize resilient infrastructure actions in both rural and urban areas? Thank you.
Good question. Titi, I'll go back to you because that's precisely what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's not just prioritising. You're prioritising on the run.
Yep.
You're doing it in real time, responding to a real emergency with limited resources.
Yes, that's a very good question. How do we prioritize infrastructure resilience in the rural and urban areas? And also like to add on, how do we prioritize infrastructure resilience right from the national level down to the community level? And that is essentially, we start off with making sure that everyone that is affected are part of the conversation. In terms of from the national planning, we have our national plan called the Pathway for the Development of Samoa, and we have incorporated in there climate resilience and disaster risk reduction. While it's very good to have a plan, we have to have resources tagged to it to enable us to carry out what we have planned for. So in our government, we have already established the disaster risk finance policy to ensure that our national budget have climate resilience and infrastructure resilience incorporated into the national budget. At the same time, have budget available in the event of disaster happening. That's on the national level. On a sectoral level, for Land Transport Authority, we had already carried out a vulnerability assessment of our road network in Samoa that was funded by the World Bank. Now, what was good about that was that we now have a climate resilient road strategy of what are the roads, which parts of our road network that are very vulnerable to natural disasters. So we could then prioritize which part of our road network we should be focusing our investment or our resources to carry out upgrading and to making sure that they're climate resilient. So in the event that there's a next disaster coming out, and then we've already finished climate proofing that road, we're at a much better state compared to before we did any work to it. So again, coming back to having a plan and then having our resources attached to it. Right down to the community level is we need to, Samoa has started village response plans. So we have 362 villages in Samoa, and we have been able to carry out complete 98 village response plans. We still have a lot of work to do to finish up the rest of the response plans in the event of a disaster, but we have started the work. Now, the good thing about these village response plans is it's inclusive. We're including the people in the villages. We're including the vulnerable groups, the disability, and as well, especially our women and children, especially, the women being very at the forefront of caring of our children, organizing all events in our villages and churches and such. They have a very powerful insight and very valuable input into our plans at the community level. And also, these plans, at the national level, there is no use if it cannot be communicated in the language that could be understood by our people. I spoke of this yesterday as well. The words climate change, climate resilience, adaptation. I do not know a Samoan, word for those words. So you have to explain in our language what it means to, what those words mean. So then, people could understand and better gauge their thoughts into the response plans. Yeah. So how you prioritize it, so including that in all levels of planning from national to community level, and as well as the resources that should go along with it.
And Mami, what Titi's talking about at a local level, you're involved with at an international, global level, isn't it? How do you take some of those lessons, language, culture, bringing voices like women's voices to this? How do you apply that globally?
It's such a joy listening to you, Titi, because, and Brendan, you too, because what you are telling us is absolutely how Sendai framework is translated into a country's policies and strategies. Because, as you know, the priorities of the Sendai framework is to understand your risk, the vulnerabilities, and then to have a plan, governance, a risk governance which is comprehensive, and how you invest in it. And if, unfortunately, like we do now so frequently, you have a devastating disaster, then you build back better. But so actually what I'm trying to say, Stan, here is that Sendai framework is translated into these national strategies and also local strategies. And when we share these concrete examples of how Sendai framework works in these conferences, in workshops, then it goes back to the global level once again. And you mentioned one important thing about the voices. So one thing which is very important, I mentioned about the national strategies that all countries should have on their disaster risk reduction. And if those national strategies do not incorporate the voices of women and girls, but not only all the vulnerable groups, people living with disability, indigenous people, the poor, etc., then the strategy is not good enough because you're not tackling the vulnerability of your country or your local city. So what we do at the global level is that we talk about this, that you need to incorporate the voices of these people. And again, when we have great examples of such things, like in Samoa or Australia, where these voices, Titi was saying that you have to listen to the local people, because if you don't do that, it's not good enough. When we can at UNDRR say that, look what Samoa is doing, look what Australia is doing, then the global conviction to implement together the Sendai framework becomes stronger, because there kicks in the international cooperation part that you were talking about, Kamal. A lot of countries can't do it alone. But if countries are making their own efforts, then there will be a renewed commitment to enhance international cooperation for prevention, which is lacking at this point.
I want to come to you in just a sec, Kamal, because it does lead to our next question. These questions are very much connected. Question number 5.
Good morning. I am Kazi Baby, Executive Director of Participatory Development Action Program. I am from Bangladesh. We are working in urban slum areas. The slum dwellers do not have permanent shelter. My question is, how can we make infrastructure in urban slum areas more disaster resilient? Thank you.
And that's precisely what we've been talking about, isn't it? The disconnect, Kamal, from global or national responses, national or global frameworks, and the lived experience of people on the ground, precisely what Mami was talking about, the most vulnerable people. So how do you make them more disaster resilient? I suspect before the disaster happens as well.
Thanks. I think that's a great question. Before I answer that question, I just want to preface that by some facts. So sometime in 2008, for the first time in human history, more people started living in urban areas than rural areas. And countries like mine are swiftly getting there as well. So rapid urbanization is here with us. And when the urban development policies do not work, or they work suboptimally, they lead to slums. So slums are a symptom of failed urban development policies. So there is no substitute to getting urban development policies right. So that is a fundamental. Now, coming back to services, I would say there are 3 things we need to do to ensure that slum areas in urban slums get good services. Number 1 is a more people-centric approach, where we actually bring them into dialogue as to what is the minimum level of basic service they require. I think there is way too much focus on measuring the road lengths we are building, or irrigation channels we are building. I think we need to turn it around to look at what are the services that they're offering. The second thing is that really stronger focus on social infrastructure. People who have never had access to basic services from social infrastructure need to get that basic service. And the third point is that there are many urban systems where ecological services provided by urban water bodies, local urban forests. I think we really need to integrate that into imagining infrastructure for urban areas, rather than looking at physical gray infrastructure as separate from green infrastructure. And that requires a new imagination in how our institutions work, where departments of environment are responsible for protecting the green infrastructure, and then there are departments of infrastructure that build infrastructure. How do we come up with a system where there's a joined up thinking of that? In many urban areas, if we revived urban lakes, urban water bodies, for example, it would improve the quality of life of urban citizens. but we don't have that imagination. We think that this is being protected just because, it is virtuous to do so. It's not just virtuous, it makes sense in terms of quality of life as well.
Brendan, Australia is a highly urbanised society, and comparatively to the rest of the world, high levels of infrastructure. And yet we often see rural areas particularly impacted by natural disaster, fire and flood. And the things that people in the cities may take for granted don't necessarily exist in those rural areas. You mentioned before Indigenous communities, First Nations communities that are even dealing with the added pressures of remoteness and poor infrastructure. So it's sort of, how do we in Australia meet the needs of our vulnerable communities when so much focus is on urban areas which take up so much of the resources and the support?
You raise a really good point, because this is the conversation that is going on throughout Australia right now, is what are the safety nets available to our most vulnerable populations, be they urban or be they rural, remote, coastal, First Nations. And I think that's important, is that we initially build our system and our capabilities, our policy structures around a safety net. But at the same time, we must incentivise the provision of services so that we can actually get services to those most rural and remote communities that currently now, once impacted by a disaster, actually require the most assistance. Now, if we look at how we actually allocate funding to that right now, if we don't have that early engagement with those communities and understand what's important to them, not only for the functioning of that community immediately after an event, but what actually nourishes that community and allows it to flourish into the future, if we don't understand those chronic stresses and deal with them in a lot of the other policy arms that we have, we can't really build disaster resilience for those. And right now we're having that conversation here in Australia about where we put people, how we build, and how we sustain those communities. And what our approach here very much is, as the incentives to invest more in disaster risk reduction, is it's all predicated on understanding what those local needs are and identifying those priorities. And if we talk about those remote communities, connectivity, communications, power, availability of medical services.
Even in a country like, the first thing that happens, and we're seeing this now in rural New South Wales where they're dealing with floods, the first images that appear on the screen are of communities that are isolated, immediately isolated. Isolated to begin with, but then isolated by natural disaster. What you're talking about is something Australia could have done 10 or 20 years ago as well. What is the time frame for being able to deliver just on those things that you were talking about, that connectivity and infrastructure and building that resilience? How long are we talking about?
We need to do it now. The signals are here and now. Not only in Queensland, we've experienced it in New South Wales this year, and prior to that, 2 years ago in Victoria as well with the bushfires. These are the challenges and the trigger events which will galvanise action from a policy, investment, community involvement, the building of a capacity to actually can deal with the size, the scale and the intensity of these events. Action is required now. We don't need to wait for any more data. We need to take action now.
Titi, it's the same in Samo, isn't it? You're dealing with urbanisation, people who come to the larger centres, and also the disconnect between, and those people themselves are going to have to deal with poor infrastructure or lack of services, and then that divide to the rural areas as well that you were talking about earlier.
Yes, indeed. With Samoa, the majority of our population are moving into our city of Apia because the majority of the employment that are offered in the town area, and also the majority of our government, main government offices are within the town area. Now our government is moving towards As if you've been to Samoa or if you've read about Samoa, we've got the Savaii as the big island and Upolu as the island where the city is in. And government is moving to try and relocate and have branches of their offices in the big island. So then to try and encourage our people to, not all move into the town area. At the same time, the area of Apia, where Apia is at, is a flood-prone area. So we have carried out major works to try and upgrade our drainage network and our road network within the town area. But with climate change, we will be planning long-term to relocate where our town will be located.
That's hugely expensive too.
Indeed, it is a huge, undertaking. But then it also comes down to the investments in terms of financing, as well as people that will have to carry out this long-term planning, and also to, in the event when we do get to that stage where we're going to need to start relocating, our people that are going to be working and carrying this out must be fully capable. And, this is one thing to add into our conversation, that would really contribute to disaster risk reduction, is working with our educational institutions. I spoke on this again yesterday in Samoa, in the context of Samoa. In order for you to get a Bachelor of Engineering degree, you have to come to New Zealand, Australia, or University of South Pacific in Fiji. Our local universities do not offer a Bachelor of Engineering degree. So for me, as an example, I graduated from University of Queensland with my degree in engineering. Now, with COVID, what has happened is that our students have not been able to come to Fiji, Australia, New Zealand to carry out their studies. And at the same time, some of our students who had already started studying have had to go back home to Samoa. Now, we foresee an issue where there will be a time where we will not have, or we will have limited number of graduate engineers to feed back into our country's engineering workforce. Now, how are we able to carry out this, our disaster risk reduction plans if we don't have the people to do the work? So we have started our work with the universities in Samoa, including our National University of Samoa, as well as the University of South Pacific, who they have a branch in Samoa, and see if they are able to offer some of the courses that would produce the skill set that is required by the workforce. So not necessarily an engineering degree, but the courses that will have, that will teach the skill set that we need in the workforce. So then we can mitigate impact of not having, new engineering graduates to feed into our workforce. So just some ways that our country and our government with limited resources have had to think outside the box, to deal with the situation that we are being presented. And I highly urge all our participants in here and from your respective countries, to do the same. We are in a very unprecedented times, and what has worked in the past, sometimes it's not going to work right now.
Yeah, and that leads very much to our next question as well, question number 6.
Hello, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Ibnu Munzir, the Secretary for Development and Planning Agency of Palu City Government. Thank you for letting me participate in the APMC DRR 2022. I would like to ask question maybe to all the speaker about what role can community play the ensuring resilience in integrated and implemented in infrastructure project and management. Do you have any specific example of the best practice around engagement and coordination which resulted in increasing resilience of the infrastructure system? Thank you very much, and greeting from Palu. Maybe grow back stronger, be prepared, and more resilient. Thank you.
What a brilliant question. Kamal, I might go to you on that. I'm particularly interested in the specific examples. You talked about specific examples of best practice. We can talk in the abstract about what needs to be done, but where are some examples of where it is being done?
So that was a great question and great spirit.
Great spirit. And a great backdrop.
That's a cause for hope. I want to say two things. One is that, as Titi was saying a few minutes ago, past is no longer a good guide for the future. And one of the things that we are facing in infrastructure systems now is much greater interdependency. Earlier, I was speaking to Brandon before the session, and he was talking about how early warning systems that are dependent on solar-powered transmission systems didn't work because it was a cloudy day. So how do we sort of handle this? In a cyclone-prone area, a cyclone comes, it knocks off power, but it doesn't just knock off power. It knocks off telecommunications. When the telecommunications go off, the ATM machines don't work. When the ATM machines don't work, people don't have access to their own cash. When people don't have access to their cash, local markets don't work. And these kind of interdependencies have become more and more in the 21st century. And we know how to model the risk of each individual thing, but how they connect each other, we are not very good at that. So how do we go beyond managing risk to managing uncertainty? And that's where, examples of communities working at the local level, for example, monitoring embankments, health of embankments during floods, communities playing a role in crowdsourcing early warning of what they're actually seeing, and building a second line of defense, or sometimes even a first line of defense against the threats that are imminent, is the kind of stuff we need to do. So much greater involvement. So we have to demystify all of this, a lot of this science, and really make local participation in different aspects of managing risk much more vibrant.
Mummy, in a word, what Kamal's talking about is, and it's been a theme throughout this, is preparedness. It's not just responding, but it's preparing.
No, absolutely. So preparedness is a big part of the Sendai framework, isn't it? That we need to be better prepared. And before that, we need to prevent better. But what I wanted to add to what Kamal said, which is very important. So first, to start with an example that I saw in Bali, Indonesia, when we held a global platform for disaster risk reduction in May. I was taken to a community which had, by themselves, started to clean up their sewage system, clean up the river that provides, well, both, in a way, water for their livelihood, but also where some, dangerous substance can be dumped, and trying to manage it. And I saw that the community resilience was being built by themselves. But what I wanted to mention here is that in the area of resilient infrastructure, communities can play an important role, but it is here primarily really the governments that need to play a crucial role. Because as we heard from Titi and as we heard from Brendan, if the governments don't have, and as you said, Kamal, come up with a very robust risk analysis of where and how to establish an infrastructure, if the governments don't have a very integrated risk governance plan, bringing together disaster risk reduction element, but also the element of climate risk, but also the element of urbanization, then, and if it is not invested in by public money, because of course, you know, you said that's expensive, right? Too many things. It is expensive. It's not something that can be done without the national government's commitment to investing into prevention. If that's not there, then unfortunately, no matter how much the communities want to contribute to this and make their own environment resilient by doing what they can, it's only not going to be enough. It won't be scaled up. So that's what I wanted to say. But of course, I'm very curious to hear about any community-led examples, which I'm sure would exist in many countries.
And we'll continue that conversation because our final question very much goes to the same issue. Let's go to our final question, question number 7.
Your Honor, good morning. Good morning. I'm Engel Regadas, Chairman of the Pacific Resilience Partnership, which is a multi-stakeholder partnership for the implementation of the framework of development, resilient development in the Pacific. The question here is, are there any concrete steps in making our infrastructures and systems resilient? Please include best practices of areas in Asia and the Pacific where this strategy has worked well.
Thank you. Brendan, that's been the theme throughout almost all the questions, but people are looking for real examples. What can you point to that Australia may be doing well that others can learn from?
I'll use 2 examples, if I may. One is that locally led approach. So we have this really cool community engagement process where we have what's called the Big Map process. And we have a 10 by 10 satellite view of a community's catchment or its local government area. And we get all members of the community to be involved in understanding what infrastructure, how it performs during an event, after an event, what are the priorities for those communities, where are the pinch points in terms of energy supply, communications, those sorts of things. And that feeds in, once we get that community view, that feeds into a local resilience strategy. And there is an action plan that sits behind it. And then whenever there are funding opportunities available to build more resilient infrastructure, those communities use those as the template and their priorities. So it's clearly locally led, and our role from a policy perspective is about bringing capability to that. It then goes on to the delivery of betterment programs, so more resilient infrastructure. We are aware of what communities' priorities are. We know the designs and we know the solutions that actually work for particular events. We clearly understand that through our engagement with the community, and we resource the implementation of those in additional areas that have shown to be vulnerable. And you build that up from a local level to a regional level to a state, and it follows to a national level, so that all of our communities, as you touched on before, some of those remote communities that hitherto have really struggled, is that when they have that clear line of sight between that local action and the funding opportunities available, the outcomes will follow.
Does it also go, Brendan, to the public face of that? Because bureaucracy can appear to be so remote. People in communities will often say, well, we only hear from people when something happens. So who are the point people, the faces that people go to? I know there's local government that has a particular role to play, but communities themselves, we're talking about specific communities, also need to have line of sight, people they can trust, people that Titi was talking about before who can the role of women, for instance, who can play that role in those communities. How are we building that, and what are the public faces that people turn to?
So certainly here in Queensland, we have a very, very close connection between local government and their communities. Very, very strong governance structures. It is well practiced because they've had plenty of experience in the last 10 years or so with some 100 events. And bringing communities together and leading that initial response and the recovery, local government are essential and are central to that because of that close connection with their communities. But we find that during significant events, that capacity is drawn down fairly quickly, and that's when the state and the Commonwealth will start to enter that space to provide that additional capability and mobilise resources as well. It's well practiced and it works. Importantly though, what we are hearing is I think we can get caught up in how many dollars we save in resilient infrastructure, that sort of narrative. But I think importantly, if you talk to the community, functionality immediately after an event, can I reconnect with other communities? Can I get my children to school, access markets, access health services? Is that we know resilient infrastructure works. And if we look here in Queensland, for example, 80% of our investment in resilient infrastructure is functional immediately after an event or very, very shortly thereafter. It's recognised in the community and there is a strong alignment at all levels of government for more of it.
Titi, because you've already spoken about the need to have better relationships, but part of the question here was about operation and maintenance as well. Talk to that in your experience in Samoa.
Yeah, with the maintenance of our larger infrastructure is a huge challenge for our organization, and mainly because of the resources available. So annually LTA gets a government budget of 45 million tala, which is about 20 million Australian dollars. You know, and that is both funding for capital works and maintenance. Now, I'm sure my friend here, Brendan, will be like, that's very small budget, but that is indeed the reality that we are faced with. Hence, the prioritization is very crucial, because we cannot do everything that we would like all at once. But it's why we have, it's very key that we have such as the climate resilient road strategy, which prioritize out the roads that we should be, you know, dedicating our work and our efforts to from one year to the other. But also the, to assist with the question on locally led or community led projects that have been successful. I would like to share the experience of Samoa in terms of determining where water sources are. You know, we've, Samoa, we have, while we have the local expertise in government, we usually would engage consultants to find where there's, where's the best spot to drill a borehole to get water. And most likely we end up depending on people of that village who have lived there for many years, who have, you know, who have much better understanding than us, who come in who think we are experts, but we're not. And they would tell us, this is where we drill. And 99.9% of the time they are correct, which is good in a way also, because they will be the one that will be benefiting from the water as well as the infrastructure that will be laid across that village. And so they would also be made aware, and we work together to make sure that the infrastructure is maintained and not damaged during the lifetime you know, the pipelines are there.
Mummy, I might just, we're almost out of time, but I might just get a final comment from you about the role that rich countries play, that wealthy countries play. Are wealthy countries doing enough when it comes to supporting others? There's clearly a gap in capacity and resources and infrastructure, and while there are lessons to be learned from the experiences of countries like Australia and others, what is needed actually? What can wealthier countries do, and does it require more financial support?
So, of the 7 global targets of the Sendai framework, there's one that says we need to enhance international cooperation for disaster risk reduction and prevention, because of many issues, but because a lot of the developing countries, especially the LDCs, are pressed with so much day-to-day issues that they do not have capital to invest in prevention, although it's essential. So we need, and that target is not met, so we need to enhance it. Having said that, there is a lot of many countries which invest in supporting developing countries, LDCs and SIDS in this area. Australia is one of them, Japan, but others as well. So, and unfortunately right now, because of the multiple crises, starting with climate emergency, COVID, recession kicking in, unfortunately, and a war in Ukraine that impacts, there is, in spite of all the generosity, a lot of challenges that the best donors are facing too. Plus the humanitarian demand that comes from so many disasters is skyrocketing. But I would say here that we still need to enhance this international cooperation because we saw how much the world is connected between COVID. What starts as a disaster in one part of the world, no matter how far you think it is, does not stay there. Now we know that. So, of course, you know, from a humanitarian point of view, it's important to extend support in terms of better prevention, but it's also about the whole global being safe. Because if people are displaced, if people need to migrate because of climate emergency, then they will come to you. And you can be generous about that, but you can be generous before welcoming them in making their own cities and countries more resilient.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your questions. Obviously, the lessons that we take away from this conversation is that we are out of time and that we are doing this in real time right now, that people are responding on the ground, dealing with the realities that they face, not just climate realities, but political realities and economic realities. And we heard from Titi there, the need for better infrastructure, the need to integrate rural and urban communities, to build better urban infrastructure, to make sure that we mitigate these problems or avoid these problems by better planning. And for the world, as Mami said at the end there, for the world to step up, that while there is huge demand on the world, there is also great capacity and the ability to work together to deal with a common threat. So please, thank you again for your questions. Thanks for attending, and please thank our panel. I think you've all earned a coffee and a morning tea break before the rest of the day continues. So thank you.